Camping, the quintessential practice for all outdoorsy folk. Some might call it fun, and others may call it actively becoming a human burrito in your sleeping bag, ready to be eaten for the horrors that await in the woods. But that's down to you. For now though, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My father and I are avid campers. Not professionals, but my dad used to be a wilderness guide for kids. We typically prefer the eastern western Sierras, as they have great car camping spots next to lakes and a lot of great trails. Last summer, we decided to go up for a 2-night stay and do some day hiking. The campground was pretty full, not unusual for the summer, but we were lucky enough to find a pretty secluded site where we set up our tents. The first night was normal, little bear activity, but we're used to that. The second night, I crawl into my backpacking tent and I pass out cold. Until about 3 a.m, when I wake up to the sounds of footsteps. My dad is a diabetic and needs to get up to pee around 3 to 4 times a night. And the sounds are definitely footprints, but they're coming from the wrong direction. We were located next to the bathrooms, so the footsteps should be moving in that direction, but they're coming closer to my tent. They stop about a yard short, and the breathing gets really heavy. I first brush it off as my dad, maybe lost without a flashlight. The breathing goes away, and I fall back asleep, only to be awoken a few minutes later to breathing right above my tent. You know that terror? The rush that goes up your spine. I had that. This wasn't my dad. I lay perfectly still, but the footprints continued to circle the tent. I had the rain fly on, so I couldn't see through the roof, and it was a new moon and pitch black. Now I convinced myself that as a heavy sleeper, I am just dreaming. Just as that thought runs through my head, I feel a single finger run the length of my foot through the tent. Really slow and methodical. Now I figure I have to be dreaming, because my foot is in my sleeping bag and couldn't possibly feel that. But the comfort disappeared quickly when I realized, using the small ambient light available, that my foot was bare and out of the bag. I lay frozen as whatever it was stroked my foot for a minute or two, gave a few more laboured breaths, and then just stood above my tent for what felt like an eternity before disappearing. I stayed up all night. In the morning, I heard my dad get out of his tent. I bolted up and met him by the fire. He looked me in the eye and asked if I had gotten up the night before. I asked him the same, and he said he had around 2 a.m. because he thought someone was going through our stuff. As I told him my story, we noticed our gear had been rearranged on the table. Every item, nothing taken. Footprints in a perfect circle around my tent. We still can't even talk about it without getting seriously skeeved out. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest. some great state parks, and a ton of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, a lot of people where I live are really poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I can do most of my work online. If I didn't have that going for me, well, I'd have to move somewhere else. It's just one of those small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there too long, without anything else going for you at least. Except a handful of doctors and lawyers and Georgia Power Company employees. The only employment in the area is at Walmart, fast food, and a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town, there is a massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking on them with my dog, but it can be a bit of an unnerving experience sometimes. It's about a 10-mile drive from town, and there's no cell phone service or homes for miles. In the past, there have been a lot of vehicle break-ins at the trailheads. The gravel parking lots at some of them glitter with bits of broken glass from what I'm guessing were car windows. Sometimes there are really shifty people hanging around these trailheads, or just driving around on the forest roads. They are really rough roads, and you'll see these beat-up $500 cars just barreling along roads meant for 4x4. Some of the people you see in the cars look like the guy that got crushed by an ATM in Breaking Bad. All that being said, it is still a great place to camp. However, you just have to be careful. So a few years ago, two of my friends and I decided to go play paintball in the national forest. I know, it probably isn't legal. We decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip, so that we could play the next morning too. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drove a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. But unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up all the spots in the area. This was really the only camping spot that we were familiar with, and it was getting pretty late. We decide to keep on looking, so we drive for about an hour further and further into the woods. By this time, it's getting a bit dark, and we're getting a bit worried about finding a spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us had any service. We turn off onto an unfamiliar road that isn't in very good shape. In fact, it looks like the Forest Service rangers used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. The broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. That said, it looked like the 4x4 vehicles had been going over the mound, so it was pretty worn down. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to go over the mound. There was an old gravel road on the other side, and the road was pretty much clear of debris. We drove a few miles down this road and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood table nailed to a tree, which seemed kind of odd. That said, it was pretty much dark at this point, and we didn't want to keep driving around all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck light running, and we set up the tent. As we began setting up the tent, I started to notice that there was a lot of trash in the woods surrounding the site. I see a green bottle laying on the ground. I take a look at the bottle, and I see it's a bottle of home and garden insecticide. I was really tired at the time, and just thought that someone had been dumping their home garbage out there. None of us thought it was weird that someone would be dumping garbage in an area that is more than an hour from the nearest home. We set up our camp. We had some beers and made chili from scratch. It was delicious. By this time, it was probably around 11 p.m. As we're eating, we notice a faint glow from the other side of nearby hills. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles didn't make sense. It didn't seem to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving. It was kind of like that glow you see over a bright city. We couldn't see the light source itself, though. Since there were no other access roads in the area, we decided it wasn't other campers. The hill was about a quarter mile from our campsite, so we decided to investigate. Under normal circumstances, I know I wouldn't have done so. However, we all had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, and two of us, Jacob and I, decided to take a look. My other friend Isaac decides to stay behind and pop some popcorn over the fire. We start walking towards the light source, and the situation gets even stranger. All the trees in the area have their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. We thought it could have been the work of beavers that lived in the creek, but it seemed strange that a beaver would just go around all these trees and knock off the bark in a circle. Jacob and I are talking about the ghost beaver in pretty loud voices. This is probably due to our drunkenness, as we're almost at the top of the hill, and Jacob tripped and yelled, "Oh shit." A few seconds after he yelled, the light, whatever it was, went out. We looked at each other and decided that maybe we didn't need to see what the light was after all. We walked back in silence and kept looking back every few seconds. We decided to turn off our flashlight and just use the moonlight to get back to the campsite. When we get a couple of 100 feet from the campsite, I can see my other friend Isaac walking around the campsite. He was wearing a hooded coat that I hadn't seen him wearing before. For some reason, he's carrying his paintball gun around his hand. That seemed a little odd, we said to each other. The fire had started to die down, so we couldn't see our campsite very well. At this point, we'd been gone for almost an hour, and from the distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He kept walking around the site and was peering in the tent. When we were almost back at camp, we saw Isaac walk up the road we came in on. We figured that he was going to use the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us. When we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for Isaac to return. All of a sudden, we see him lurch out of a tent. He stumbles a few feet and vomits. After we left, he had a few more rum and cokes, he mumbles. We ask him why he kept wandering around the campsite with a paintball gun, and he gets a strange look on his face. They're locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it? We go and check the truck, enter the door code, and see that all our paintball equipment was just as we had left it. The keys to the truck were still hidden in a magnetic fob underneath. I get a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Isaac, what were you doing after we left? I ask. I was watching a movie on my phone. Then I fell asleep, I guess. But you were walking around with a paintball gun, right? Did you just change jackets? Isaac said he had been in the tent since we left, and that he had been wearing the same unhooded fleece all night. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it wasn't Isaac. At this point, all of us are way too drunk to drive, but we decide to go ahead and pack up and go back to my house for the night. We don't bother packing up the tent. We just fold it down with the sleeping bags and everything in it. We jump into the F-150 and I start to drive out. When we get to the dirt hump, we see something grey blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been lying in the woods earlier is now back on its stand, right on top of the hump. By this point, all of us had sobered up to the situation, and no one wants to get out of the cart and try and move the barrier. I had a metal guard on the front of the F-150, so I drive forward slowly, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck. It falls right off. I assume it just must have been balanced there, and we drove over it, slowly. We were terrified that it would pop one of the truck's tires as we drove, but fortunately, it did not. As we drive down the road, we see a vehicle following us with its lights off. It's probably 1,000 feet behind us, but we keep catching glimpses of it as the moon reflects light off it. I start to drive as fast as I can on the Forest Service Road, and the other vehicle keeps pace. It doesn't get any closer though. It just stays 1 or 2 turns behind us. We can only see it when the road straightens out. And after about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we make it back to the main paved road. I start to drive everyone back to my house, but I decide to go a different way just to be safe. I didn't get pulled over for a DUI, luckily. Camping can be fun, but very rural camping can be dangerous. I've driven past that metal barrier since that time, but it's always been in place. I would never go down that road again though. I work summers as a camp counselor in the northern parts of Ontario, Canada. On the summer this particular incident occurred, I was camping with a group of 10-year-old boys on the same lake the summer camp was based on. So, like a routine camping trip, we canoe out to the site and set up our tents. Me and my co-counselor Mike take turns supervising the kids while they swim, build forts, and play games. We cook some food over the fire, sit around and tell stories, cook s'mores, the typical Canadian camping experience. Around 9:30, I tell the kids that it is time for bed, and they head into their tents, which were positioned a small walk away from the shoreline, but still in line of sight from where we had the fire pit. So the kids have gone to bed, and Mike and I are shooting the shit by the water, just smoking a cigarette. We basically were hanging out before we decided to head into our tent and call it a night. What happened next still troubles me to this day, and remains my go-to scary campfire story. We were both gazing into the pitch black night water when we saw a small light approach us slowly and slightly above water level. We speculated what it could possibly be for a few minutes, before it came close enough for us to see that it was mounted on the front of a kayak, and that someone was approaching our campsite. Now, it is important to note that as a camp counselor, part of our training goes over how to deal with stranger encounters in an environment where we are responsible for a group of children on public property. I was prepared to give the mystery paddler the typical speech about how we are camping with a group from a recognized organization, and that we respectfully ask that they find another campsite. However, this person's appearance shook me to the bone. As the light drew nearer, paddling this kayak was a woman who looked to be in her 60s. She had incredibly long wisps of grey hair that were trailing in the water. Her skin looked like old leather, and her dead-looking eyes were tough to spot under all her wrinkles. She looked directly at me, and when she spoke, I realized she was missing most of her teeth. "Are your children safe in bed?" she asked me, pointing in the direction of the tents. Not really knowing how to respond, and, quite frankly, shitting myself, I responded by telling her that we were fine, and she had to leave. "That's good, just as expected for this time," she said with a smile, then turned her kayak and paddled off into the night. At this point in time, Mike and myself were legitimately very creeped out, not only by the appearance of this mysterious woman, who resembled a freaking corpse, but also her inquiry on the whereabouts and safety of the kids we had brought on the trip. Not knowing what else to do, we grabbed our hunting knives and sat by the fire after checking on the kids. Half an hour later is where shit started to get really creepy. Across the lake, a female counselor was leading another trip for kids of the same age group. She sent me a text which read something along the lines of, "Hey Sean, stop screwing with us. This isn't funny. My kids are really creeped out." I instantly called her and let her know I had just seen someone near my campsite that seemed eerie, and that I was not trying to play a joke. Apparently, one of their kids had opened their tent door to take a piss, and had seen a woman with long hair standing with her arms open towards them near the shoreline. Last summer, my boyfriend and I went camping in some nature preserve in Pennsylvania. I can't remember its name. It was pretty primitive camping. No cell service, and we saw 2 other people the entire time we were there. It was huge, so it was pretty empty. My boyfriend pretty much immediately said these 2 people seemed off to him right away. I don't know if they had anything to do with what happened that night, but I will describe them. The first person was a woman who had her truck parked off the trail and the hood open. I don't really notice these type of things, but my boyfriend said it looked to him like she was waiting for someone to pull off besides her and offer to help with her truck. Normally, my boyfriend is the type to at least offer to call someone, but he said she skeeved him out enough, so he didn't want to draw her attention more than necessary. The next person we drove by several times whilst we were setting up. He just kept driving by slowly and looking at us. I didn't even notice though, until my boyfriend had already pointed out that he'd done it twice before. Whether these 2 people had anything sinister going or not, the real story had to do with what woke us at around 3 a.m. It was incredibly loud and sudden. I couldn't describe it, or even compare it to anything, but my boyfriend said it sounded to him similar to a chain gun revving up, or someone using a large metal tool to scrape gravel. My boyfriend jumped up and looked out the little window of the tent. The sound happened again and again, and was getting noticeably closer each time. I was about to piss myself, but my boyfriend told me it was probably miles off. I didn't question this, because loud noises can be heard from miles off, right? Well, later, my boyfriend told me that's because he didn't want to scare me. It really sounded like it was coming from right down the little dirt road. At one point, he said he suspected it was right in front of our campsite. The only reason he didn't tell me to get out and dart for the car was because he was afraid it could be someone trying to scare us out the tent for some dreadful reason. He whispered. I should have noticed he was whispering and knew something was wrong, since otherwise he'd just speak normally, right? For me to go back to sleep. However, I couldn't, because every sound I heard made me think someone was sneaking up to the tent. Eventually, my boyfriend told me to get out and help him pack up. It was maybe 20 minutes after the sound stopped. He held our only weapon, a machete, in front of him. It was a full moon, or close to it, and we didn't need a light. While we were packing quickly, I noticed an empty beer can close to our dead campfire. It wasn't there when we were asleep around 10 p.m, and neither of us had bought any beer. Thankfully, we got out of there, and for the rest of the trip, we either camped in areas well populated by the campers, or got a hotel room. My boyfriend and I are a young couple in their mid-college years. We decided that we wanted to get away from working and our studies for the weekend. So we took a trip to the nearest hiking trail that is part of the Appalachian Trail. We decided to leave on a Friday once I got off work and backpack up the trail in order to camp there over the weekend. You see, I work in a restaurant, and it is very difficult to have a set time of when I am going to leave work. I ended up leaving work around 4, but we said that no matter what, we would be going on this trip. We finally left for the trail, and we began hiking at around 5:30. My boyfriend was an Eagle Scout, so we had all of the necessary supplies for a successful camping trip. A tent, sleeping bags, sleeping pads, pots, pans, stove, clothes, food, and of course, necessary substances to free our minds after the long hike. The first part of the hike was absolutely exhausting. It was all uphill, and we were both carrying at least 40 pounds in our metal-framed backpacks. An hour later, we finally passed the first shelter. If not, many of you know, a shelter on this trail is a 10-foot by 15-foot log cabin that only has 3 walls, as it is open to the outside. It is specifically used as a shelter to sleep in or hide from the rain. Midway through the hike, it began to pour dramatically in the forest, and sooner or later, we were both soaked from head to toe. The fog grew quickly, as it had been a hot and humid Friday. The trail became very slippery, and our pace slowed down tremendously. We had hoped that we were getting closer to the campsite, but it turned dark very, very quickly. We took a rest in the dark as it poured on us, in hopes that we would find our headlamps. Once we managed to find them, we placed them on our heads, still struggling to balance ourselves on top of the rocky and muddy path. I thought that by that point, we would never make it to the shelter. We walked, never giving up, although I wanted to, as my socks and shoes were wet. I was tired, hungry, drenched, and cold. The temperature had dropped more than 25 degrees Fahrenheit as we made our way up. It was around 8:30 when we finally made it through to the second shelter and campgrounds. There was a split in the path. Either you could walk straight to continue to the top of the view, which was about 1.5 miles, or you could turn slightly and walk to the right, to the campgrounds. Or you could take a 90-degree turn to the right and walk to the shelter. At that point, we were drenched from head to toe and needed to dry off. It was still raining to beat the band, so it would have been nearly impossible to set up our tent in our camp. We had decided we would stay put in the shelter until the rain had calmed down. We didn't hear anyone at the shelter, so I was extremely excited to have the place to ourselves and take a few tokes, if you know what I mean. After our hike, I was dead set on it. Once we walked down the shelter and got to the opening, there was a man and a woman in their 60s. We instantly thought to ourselves that they were an older married couple who wanted to get away for the weekend too. We told them that we wouldn't be bothering them for long, so we wet our backpacks down and attempted to dry off. The couple were very welcoming, with a lantern and an absorbing towel for me to dry off. My boyfriend and I both took our shirts off since they were both carrying a lot of water weight. The couple seemed to be very normal, and the man brought a cute dog with him that I enjoyed playing with. We began introducing ourselves with our names, where we were from, and what we were doing. They both said that they were in their 60s. Their names were Joe and Maya, and they were just messing around for the weekend. In between sentences, they were taking large gulps of what looked to be alcohol in their water packs. They said they were just having fun and met online, which veered off into dropping hints that they were on the trail having an affair. The older woman, who says that she comes from West Virginia, struck me as very off. It began with her looks, having scraggly shoulder-length grey hair, with circular glasses resting on her face. Her teeth were very dark, nearly covered with a brown film, as if she had used hardcore drugs in the past. She wore a pullover, hiking boots, and jean shorts that nearly exposed everything. Joe, on the other hand, was just your average white male, who had grey hair and a tad overweight. They spoke about their past employments and what they had done in life. Maya said she was a writer, which I did admire. Information about ourselves was exchanged too, since they seemed very friendly. I was in a bad mood though, and very irritable until I smoked some. My boyfriend and I periodically showed each other our phones in order to communicate, as we didn't have a bit of service in the shelter. We agreed that it was okay if we started smoking, since they were becoming drunk. They said they didn't mind, but would like to join. I thought it was absolutely insane that they wanted to smoke too. The man only took 2 hits, but the woman took many. She was struggling a lot to even flick the lighter. The guys began their own conversation, and the woman and I veered off into our own as well. The woman began with asking me to tell her a story. As she inched closer and closer to me, she would ask me to tell her a story. She grew more and more demanding, saying, "Tell me a story." My boyfriend and I met online, just as they did. So I was going to tell her the story about how we met. I began the story with, "So you met him online, right?" The woman nearly cuts me off and angrily says, "What? Why would you say that?" I said to her, "You all met online, right?" She nearly cuts me off again, and more aggressively says, "What? Why would you say that?" I said again, "Earlier, Joe said that you all met online, didn't you?" And then she nearly shouts and growls, "Why would you say that?" I wanted to jump away from that conversation so quickly, so I asked her, "Well, you're a writer, you said, right? So why don't you tell me one of your best stories?" The woman becomes happy and giggly, and while swirling her hands around her head in the air, she says, "Well, I am a writer, in my mind." I was extremely confused and creeped out. I didn't know what to say. I'm the type of person to laugh it off, so that's what I did. She just said she enjoyed being a writer in her mind. I look over at my boyfriend and Joe's conversation, and it seemed to be as normal as could be. There was absolutely nothing wrong about it. But Maya nearly gave me the chills as she got my attention, getting closer into my face, asking me what I was saying. The problem was that I wasn't saying anything. I was absolutely silent, ignoring her. As she began talking to herself, she would make very in-depth hand gestures as she spoke to herself, then would ask me what I was saying to her. I wasn't saying a word, and she would wonder what I was telling her. She would abruptly say, "Yes, no, maybe, no way, yeah, it can wait, huh?" As she would rock back and forth, waving her arms around. She began crossing her legs, holding her arms up in the air above her head, and started to shout, "Coming out! I'm calling out, all of you come out!" She was nearly talking gibberish. The older man's attention was caught, and he asked her what in the world she was doing. She said, "I'm calling out, it's witchcraft." I was nearly high, and was terrified of all my surroundings. It stormed loudly in the background, and was pitch black all around us. A small lamp rested on a beam above our heads in the middle of the wooden shelter. It was wet and very vulnerable. Everything slowly began to get worse that night. Maya kept slurring her words, and the man demanded she get into her sleeping bag and sleep. I sat against the wall next to my boyfriend very closely as the man crawled into his sleeping bag, and Maya attempted to put her legs in the sleeping bag but couldn't. She moved about for a very long time and finally curled up next to Joe on top of her sleeping bag. She was probably freezing. It was about 35 degrees by 9:30, and only a few minutes passed, and we heard Maya whisper, "What did you give me?" She growled again, "What did you give me?" The man finally woke up and demanded, "What?" Maya hits him on the back and yells, "What did you give me?" She jumps up immediately facing us, her eyes nearly all black, and her pupils were so enlarged she looked nearly sadistic, and yells at us, "What did you give me?" My boyfriend and I both tensed up, nearly losing our shit, and she screams asking the same question, even louder again, as her voice stretched into my eardrums. She once again turned around to the man, laying down behind him, and she whispered slowly into his ear, "Did you give me acid?" It began to run through my mind that he had drugged her, or she was having a flashback of a bad trip. Joe attempted to calm her down, but she was still restless. She lay down for 5 minutes, but Maya immediately sat up. She faced us with her legs crossed, and she stared at us without breaking contact for at least 5 minutes. She did this every so often, sitting up, staring at us, and then lying back down. She would do this over and over again, so we decided to leave immediately. We finally made our way out, as she stared at us one last time. We pitched camp as far away as possible, but I remained sleepless that night, in fear that Maya would find our tent and crawl into it. A mate of mine and his cousin decided to go on a motorbike trip around their native country of Australia. Unfortunately, on the second day, the cousin's wallet falls out of his back pocket, and it was only hundreds of kilometers later that he noticed. A note to everyone: never put your wallet in your back pocket. Anyway, now the two of them were forced to rely on only my mate's money, since all of the bank branches refused to give my cousin any money. without ID, which was of course in his wallet. Matters were complicated later when they filled up with non-sniffable Opel petrol, which buggered up their engines and required them to pay a mechanic to fix. The end result was that they had almost no money, and any money left had to be rationed for petrol. They were eating 2-minute noodles for every meal and sleeping rough. In some towns in the middle of nowhere, they would go to local pubs just for warmth and company, but could not afford to buy beer. One night, they stopped at a town that consisted of a handful of houses, a caravan park, and a hotel. When they went into the hotel, they met all the locals, including the local cop and owner of the caravan park. Mr. Caravan Park started talking with them and was getting pretty chummy because he knew that he was the only place offering accommodation, and camping in the area was illegal due to the presence of crocs, the reptile, not the equally scary footwear. Realizing that if they revealed that they were planning on illegally camping, Mr. Caravan Park could tip off the local cop. They sneaked off without anyone realizing and headed out of town. They were hoping to find some shelter, but it was featureless red dirt as far as the eye can see. After about 20 minutes, they came to a bridge and hid their bikes under it and set up camp. Even though they were in the middle of nowhere, road trains would come by regularly, which would be loud even from a distance, since the sound travelled so far and was deafeningly loud as they went over the bridge. The next morning, they all went back to the pub to get water and noticed some old photos on the wall. One of them featured a very, very large crocodile. In the background was the bridge that they had just slept under. So I was in Zimbabwe on a hike with 2 adults and about 12 teenagers. We were not following a path and just using a map on a 3-day trip to these waterfalls, as the car was there to pick us up. We come to a dam with about a 20 to 30 area of beach sand. This is very unnatural and caused a lot of discussion. Where the beach stopped, there were granite boulders and large rocks. It was very attractive, and we decided to set up camp early. 1 hour later, someone finds this cave. The mouth was small, and we had to go down on all fours to get in. But once inside, wow, 3-meter high ceilings and 10 meters long. It was amazing. There was a crack in the ceiling allowing a beam of light to come streaming through. Naturally, the majority of us wanted to sleep in there. At 1 a.m, he is telling everyone to get out, as there is a leopard outside, and this is his lair. They often chose caves to reside in. I'm not too fazed, as this guy was always scheming up practical jokes. So I rolled over and pretended to sleep. Next thing I know, my sleeping bag is being pulled off me, and I am being ordered to get out now, or I am responsible for myself. I then realized he was not kidding, so I scurried out. We all then sat as close as we could to the fire, as we watched the eyes of the leopard, pacing up and down in the darkness, less than a stone's throw away, but has the water to our backs, so we were stuck. Fortunately, The leopard did not like the activity and moved off. However, they hunt at night, and we were pretty much sitting ducks, so I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound was a threat, and every moving bush was one step closer to the end of my life. Looking at the tracks next morning that circled the campsite, we were pretty freaking lucky. I worked at a summer camp for the past few months, and I was alone with a group of 9 to 10-year-olds. The week started typically with a homesick camper. So the story goes that George can't sleep. I gave him the typical fun things at camp spiel. George calms down and lays back in bed. I lay there for a while longer, until I'm confident he's asleep, because I'm not allowed to be asleep while campers are awake. When I started going to sleep, I hear humming. This frustrates me, because I'm tired. It begins growing louder and more distant. It's really bloody creepy, and it even wakes the other kids up. I'm concerned, so I walk to him, and he just stares at me blankly in the eyes, smiling, and says, "Sweet dreams, everyone." He didn't have any recollection of it the next morning. No incidences until later in the week. It was around 11 o'clock, so all the kids are finally asleep. So I pass out until I'm woken by a crying kid. I ask what's wrong, and he says that George is scaring him and a few other boys. I see George sitting in the middle of the room, humming that tune with his head hung down. Kids around him are crying and trying to get his attention. I tell them to lay down. It'll be okay. I sit next to George and try talking him out of it, but he won't budge. I start tapping on him, trying to shake him, but he won't stop. He's just getting louder. All of a sudden, he jets up and looks around and just chuckles, walks to bed, and silently lays down. I convinced the other kids he was just sleepwalking or some shit. They calm down and fall asleep. But I can't sleep. I felt like he was staring at me all night. I went camping on a 5-mile hike off main routes here in the local woods. Just packs, food, drinks, and fire starting gear. There were 4 of us. It was around 11 p.m. when a friend of mine said he was going to walk alone back to the cars, take his, and go get more drinks. The only place open that we knew would sell them would have been 15 to 20 miles away. We all agreed don't bother because of how late it was, but he left anyway. I gave him my good mag light, and he went off. About 30 to 60 minutes after he left, the noises started. Sounds like a cross between an injured bear and a person imitating a Bigfoot. We figured it must have been said friend, and we all called him out. No response. No more noises. Another 15 minutes pass, and we figure he either really left or passed out in the woods. So the remaining 3 of us go to check on the cars to make sure he made it to them. All we had was one bad lantern and a phone light to guide us. And after about a mile or so, we heard the noises again. called out. No response. But we heard the sounds of branches snapping and rustling towards our camp. We decided that one person will head to the cars and the other two will return to camp. I ended up being one of the two to head back. Friend 2 took the lantern and we walked back just using a bit of moonlight on the phone. We walked for a mile but didn't see our campfire, but we could smell the smoke. After about 10 minutes, we found the ashes. It didn't burn out. It was smothered with water, but not by us. Enough to say we were freaked out, not being able to see anyone else out there. We couldn't start a new fire, so we decided to cut and run, loaded our stuff, except for 1 or 2 items, and hiked for about a mile until we roughly hit the spot where we separated from friend 2 and heard the noises again. This time, much closer and right behind us. Time to dash, we thought, for about 2 miles anyhow. I couldn't handle more than that. I'm a bigger guy. Pure fear got to me 2 miles in. We only went back to walking when we hit a trail, not just cutting through forest. We felt safe. Well, ish. Knowing that the cars would be in sight any moment now. We got to where the cars were parked, and something seemed weird. 2 of the 3 cars were missing. Friend 2 had left in his car, and we had no idea why. We loaded up and hopped into my car and went to leave, but noticed the car was leaning. Got out and checked the tires, and noticed there was a knife dug into one of them. My knife. I pulled it out, realizing it was mine, checked, and noticed mine was gone. Shit. We started walking down the highway, still in the deep woods towards town. Friend 1 saw us, picked us up, and we left. We came back next day for the car. Finally, we got everyone together and discussed the night. Friend 1 left and got drinks, flirted with the cashier, and picked us up. And the second friend's story is the one that freaked us out. He said he heard the noises after we split, and he went back to the cars, turned, and in the distance, saw a human outline standing there watching him, holding a small knife. They stared at one another for 30 seconds before the figure started to dash at him. He pops into his car and bolts. Don't know who to believe, except for what I've seen, but I haven't camped in those woods yet. Who knows how many times we got within feet of this supposed 5th person. I am an alpine rock climber, and I have one memory that is quite unique. My climbing partner and I are doing an easy one-day climb. We have to be at the trailhead at 2:30 a.m. and it's early alpine season. It's pretty chilly and quiet since we're the first car. I love that time of the morning. The stars are out and there is enough moonlight to see by, and it's cold. Different than winter cold. It's that windy mountain cold of early alpine season. Anyway, we carry on to get to this pass 3 miles in. It's not quite sunny when we go over the pass into the valley beyond. And when we make it back to the tree line, it's probably 5:30 to 6 a.m. and the sunrise is just hitting the peaks, and it's absolutely majestic. The valley stretches as far as the eye can see, filled with a pink fog lit by the sunrise. I'm soaking in what is one of the better sunrise sights I've seen. when I see this naked guy run through the trees about 100 feet below us, just trotting at a very determined pace. I think he's running for the trail, so we agreed to start going down after him. But the guy leaped over the trail and continued on into the woods. We started after him, called out and got no response. We continued on, and there weren't really campsites beyond where our destination was. The closest trailhead on the other side of the divide was 23 miles away. We were probably 6 miles in when we saw him, and were almost surely the earliest people on the trail. We didn't see any other lights, and none of the campsites we passed had sign of any recent activity. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the second installment in our Nature Week. Remember to tune in tomorrow for even more horrors from the middle of nowhere. I also want to give a shout out to the Grumpy Dragon. It's great to see you in the comments section again, my friend, and thank you for all the support. I'm going to be shouting someone out every day, so be sure to spam that comment section if you'd like that person to be you. I really hope that you did enjoy today's video, and if you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and a comment. It goes a long way in helping more people with a taste for horror find my channel, because it's more likely to appear on the side and more people will find it, which is a good thing, right? So don't forget to do that, subscribe and hit the little bell icon to be up to date with everything I post. And if you have a story that you would like me to read on my channel, all that you need to do is send it to my email or share it to my Reddit, which is of course available in the description. So please make sure to include as much punctuation, paragraphing, and descriptive language in your story, as that will maximize the chances of me actually reading it. But anyway, for now guys, I am going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.